In this explosive video, we dive deep into India's groundbreaking decision to support Iran through naval cooperation amidst rising tensions in the Middle East. What does India's increasing involvement with Iran mean for the region? How will this affect Israel, which is already facing international isolation due to its aggressive policies towards Palestine and Iran? We explore India's growing naval partnership with Iran, including the Chabahar Port project, the geopolitical implications of India's support for Iran on the global stage, Israel's weakening position as countries like India and others turn away from its aggressive policies, the shifting balance of power in the Middle East and Asia, and how it could mark the decline of Israel's influence, the impact of US sanctions and declining influence in the Middle East as India navigates a more independent foreign policy. As India strengthens its ties with Iran, we discuss whether this signals the beginning of the end for Israel's dominance in the region and how global power dynamics are evolving in favor of new emerging powers. This is a must-watch for anyone interested in international relations, Middle Eastern politics, or global strategy. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more insightful videos. Let's explore how changing global geopolitical landscape will hamper Israeli arrogance through today's topic. India's support for Iran, a strategic shift with global implications. In recent years, India's strategic ties with Iran have grown significantly, marking a potential turning point in the balance of power in the Middle East and South Asia. In 2024, India made headlines by deploying naval ships to Iran, a move that demonstrated its deepening cooperation with Tehran. This comes at a time of escalating tensions between Iran and Israel, a bitter rivalry that has dominated the region for decades. India's decision, therefore, has wide-ranging implications not just for these three nations, but for the geopolitical stability of the region and even the world. This comprehensive analysis examines the reasons behind India's growing alliance with Iran, the implications for Israel, and whether this could spell the beginning of the end for Israel's dominance in the region. We will also analyze Israel's isolation and the weakening of its international standing, emphasizing the errors Israel has made through its arrogance and failure to adapt to changing global dynamics. The historical context of India-Iran relations. Historical ties. India and Iran share centuries of cultural, historical, and civilizational links. Iran has played an essential role in the shaping of Indian civilization, with deep Persian influences seen in language, art, architecture, and music. These ties, while ancient, have been reinvigorated in the modern era, driven primarily by economic and geopolitical interests. Economic partnerships. India and Iran's economic relationship has been centered around energy security. Iran, being one of the world's largest producers of oil and natural gas, has been a crucial supplier of crude oil to energy-hungry India. While India had to reduce its imports from Iran after the imposition of US sanctions in 2018, its dependency on Iranian oil never fully dissipated. The development of the Chabahar Port in southeastern Iran, largely funded and developed by India, has emerged as a crucial project that further strengthens the partnership. The port not only serves as a vital hub for trade, but also offers India strategic access to Afghanistan and Central Asia, bypassing Pakistan. India's growing naval cooperation with Iran, exemplified by the recent deployment of Indian naval ships to Bandar Abbas, underscores the strategic significance of this relationship. It goes beyond economics, aiming to solidify India's influence in the region, mitigate China's growing footprint, and ensure energy security for its growing economy. The strategic calculations behind India's support for Iran. India's decision to strengthen ties with Iran amid ongoing US sanctions and its historical closeness to Israel might seem puzzling at first glance. However, India's foreign policy is becoming increasingly shaped by pragmatic and independent decision-making, reflecting the rise of a multipolar world. Here are the key drivers of this shift. 1. Energy security. Iran is critical to India's energy security strategy. Despite sanctions, Iran continues to be an essential player in the global oil market. India's vast population and expanding economy demand a steady supply of affordable energy, and Iran, with its massive reserves, is ideally positioned to fulfill this role. The US sanctions, although restrictive, have not entirely curbed India's interest in Iranian oil. Instead, India has diversified its imports and often navigated through sanctions via strategic maneuvers, including bilateral agreements with Iran that bypass the US dollar. 2. Geopolitical and regional stability. Both India and Iran share a vested interest in regional stability. The instability in Afghanistan, fueled by the rise of the Taliban and other extremist groups, has created mutual concerns for both nations. This has led to increased collaboration on intelligence sharing and counterterrorism efforts. Moreover, Iran's influence over Shiite groups in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria provides India with an indirect but effective counterbalance to the growing Sunni extremism in South Asia. 3. Chabahar Port, India's gateway to Central Asia. The Chabahar Port project is central to India's regional aspirations. Located on Iran's southeastern coast, this port provides India with direct access to Afghanistan and Central Asia without relying on the volatile routes through Pakistan. The strategic location of the port also allows India to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, which has been making inroads in the region through Pakistan's Gwadar port. Thus, the port represents more than just economic interests. It is a cornerstone of India's strategy to assert its influence in Central Asia and beyond. 4. Balancing relations with Israel and Iran. India's foreign policy has been one of balancing contradictions. While it has strengthened ties with Israel over the past 2 decades, particularly in defense and technology, it has maintained a cautious approach to its Middle East policies. Israel has emerged as a key defense partner for India, providing it with advanced military technology, while Iran remains central to its energy security and regional strategy. India's recent naval support to Iran reflects this delicate balance, aiming to protect its long-term strategic interests in the region without entirely alienating Israel. Israel's isolation and decline. The costs of arrogance. Israel has long enjoyed unparalleled support from the West, particularly the United States. However, its increasingly aggressive foreign policy, especially toward Iran, and its harsh treatment of Palestinians have alienated much of the international community. As Israel continues to adopt an arrogant and uncompromising stance, it faces a rapidly shifting geopolitical landscape where old alliances are eroding and new powers are emerging. Let's break down the reasons behind Israel's growing isolation. First, the Palestinian question, a thorn in Israel's side. At the heart of Israel's isolation lies its continued occupation of Palestinian territories and its brutal treatment of Palestinians. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been a central issue in Middle Eastern politics for over 7 decades, but Israel's unwillingness to find a peaceful resolution has only worsened the situation. Its actions in Gaza, characterized by disproportionate use of force and indiscriminate bombings, have drawn sharp criticism from international human rights organizations, which have accused Israel of war crimes. The international community, including the European Union and various UN bodies, has frequently condemned Israel's actions. However, Israel's response has often been one of arrogance, dismissing these concerns as biased or irrelevant. This arrogance is now coming back to haunt Israel as countries such as India, which once viewed Israel as a strategic partner, are increasingly distancing themselves. Second, the Iran-Israel proxy war, a self-destructive spiral. Israel's fixation on Iran as an existential threat has driven much of its foreign policy in recent years. The two nations have been engaged in a shadow war for decades, with Israel frequently targeting Iranian military assets in Syria and Lebanon. Israel's actions have further destabilized the region, prompting widespread condemnation, even from its allies. By constantly framing Iran as a threat and engaging in preemptive strikes, Israel has isolated itself not only from the Arab world, but also from many of its international partners. Many countries now view Israel as a destabilizing force in the region, more interested in preserving its own dominance than in fostering peace and stability. Third, declining US influence, Israel's greatest vulnerability. For decades, Israel has relied on US diplomatic, military, and financial support to maintain its hegemony in the region. However, US influence is waning as new global powers such as China and India assert themselves. The United States' failure to broker lasting peace in the region and its decline in global leadership has left Israel vulnerable. Without the US serving as a diplomatic shield, Israel is increasingly finding itself exposed to criticism and pressure from the international community. The United States' pivot to Asia, focusing more on countering China than on the Middle East, has weakened its commitment to Israel. Simultaneously, nations like India, which once saw Israel as a vital partner in counter-terrorism and defense, are now recalibrating their foreign policies to better align with their broader strategic interests. India's support for Iran is a direct consequence of this shift, signaling that Israel can no longer rely solely on US backing. And finally, internal political fragmentation. Israel's internal political scene is characterized by increasing division and polarization. Successive elections have resulted in fragmented coalitions that struggle to govern effectively. The rise of right-wing ultra-nationalist parties has further complicated the situation, leading to more hardline policies, particularly concerning the treatment of Palestinians and relations with Iran. This political instability weakens Israel's position on the world stage, as it becomes more difficult for the country to present a unified and coherent foreign policy. The strategic consequences of India's shift toward Iran. India's growing alliance with Iran signals a major shift in regional and global power dynamics, one that could have significant implications for Israel, the United States, and the broader Middle East. These consequences can be broken down into several key areas. First, the weakening of Israel's regional position. India's support for Iran represents a blow to Israel's strategic position in the region. For decades, Israel has relied on a complex web of alliances to counterbalance Iran's influence in the Middle East. By strengthening ties with Iran, India is signaling that it is no longer willing to align itself exclusively with Israel, particularly when doing so could jeopardize its own strategic interests. This weakens Israel's ability to isolate Iran diplomatically and militarily. Furthermore, India's naval deployment to Iran can be seen as a signal to Israel that it must reconsider its aggressive stance toward Tehran. Israel's continued military actions against Iranian targets, whether in Syria or elsewhere, are becoming increasingly difficult to justify, particularly when key nations like India are shifting their policies in favor of engagement rather than confrontation. Second, impact on US influence in the Middle East. India's growing partnership with Iran also has major implications for the United States. For years, Washington has sought to isolate Iran through a combination of sanctions and diplomatic pressure. However, India's actions could undermine these efforts, especially if other countries follow suit. India's continued oil imports from Iran, despite US sanctions, and its increased military cooperation with Tehran, represent a significant challenge to US efforts to control Iran's regional influence. This development could encourage other nations to seek similar arrangements with Iran, effectively weakening the US-led sanctions regime and diminishing Washington's ability to influence the Middle East. Additionally, as the US focuses its attention on countering China in the Indo-Pacific region, its influence in the Middle East is receding. Countries like India are taking advantage of this power vacuum to pursue their own strategic interests. For the US, which has long seen Israel as a cornerstone of its Middle East policy, India's growing alignment with Iran presents a complex diplomatic dilemma. Washington is now forced to navigate between maintaining its historical alliance with Israel and preserving its relationship with India, which is increasingly seen as a critical partner in the Indo-Pacific. Third, the Chabahar Port and China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. India's investment in Iran's Chabahar Port, which stands in direct competition with Pakistan's Gwadar Port, developed by China under the Belt and Road Initiative, offers a counterbalance to China's growing economic influence in the region. The strategic importance of Chabahar cannot be overstated. It allows India access to Afghanistan and Central Asia without relying on the unstable Pakistan-Afghanistan route, while also giving Iran an alternative to the Pakistani port of Gwadar. This move is a critical component of India's broader strategy to counter China's rising influence in South Asia and the Middle East. By deepening its ties with Iran, India positions itself as a regional power capable of shaping the future of trade and security in the Middle East and Central Asia. Israel, which has cultivated its own economic ties with China in recent years, finds itself increasingly caught between its partnerships with the US, China, and India as the global power balance shifts toward the East. Fourth, Iran's strengthened position. Iran's alliance with India offers Tehran a lifeline at a time when it is under immense pressure from both the US and Israel. As the US continues to apply sanctions and as Israel persistently targets Iranian assets in the region, India's growing support helps to ease Iran's economic and diplomatic isolation. Indian investment in Iran's infrastructure, particularly in the Chabahar port, provides Iran with access to new markets and reduces its dependency on the volatile Strait of Hormuz for oil exports. Furthermore, India's naval cooperation with Iran gives Tehran a powerful regional ally that can help it counterbalance the threat posed by Israel's military operations. The strategic partnership between India and Iran could also encourage other non-Western nations to engage with Iran, potentially leading to a broader realignment of Middle Eastern alliances. Fifth, Israel's miscalculation. The costs of arrogance. Israel's continued isolation on the global stage can largely be attributed to its refusal to adapt its policies in the face of changing geopolitical realities. Its aggressive stance towards Iran, coupled with its treatment of Palestinians, has led to a growing chorus of international condemnation. While Israel once enjoyed nearly unconditional support from the US and other Western nations, this support is increasingly being called into question. Israel's failure to seek a lasting resolution to the Palestinian conflict, combined with its ongoing military actions in Syria and Lebanon, has eroded its standing in the international community. Many countries now view Israel as a destabilizing force in the region, more interested in maintaining its own military superiority than in fostering regional peace and stability. This growing perception of Israel as an arrogant, intransigent power is damaging its relationships with key global players. Countries like India, which once valued their defense and technology ties with Israel, are now shifting their focus towards Iran, recognizing that the future of regional stability lies in engagement, not confrontation. Israel's failure to recognize this shift has left it increasingly isolated, with fewer and fewer allies willing to support its aggressive policies. And finally, the possible end of Israel's hegemony? The question now arises: is this the beginning of the end for Israel's dominance in the region? While Israel remains a formidable military power, its failure to adapt to the new realities of the multipolar world is weakening its position. Israel's arrogance, whether in its treatment of Palestinians, its relentless pursuit of military actions against Iran, or its refusal to engage meaningfully with international diplomatic efforts, has left it vulnerable. In the past, Israel could rely on overwhelming military superiority and unconditional support from the US to maintain its regional hegemony. However, as global power shifts toward Asia, with countries like India, China, and Russia playing more prominent roles, Israel's old alliances are no longer sufficient to secure its place in the region. The recent strengthening of India-Iran ties is a clear indication that the old order is changing. Countries are no longer willing to follow the US or Israel blindly, especially when doing so conflicts with their own national interests. India's support for Iran, both economically and militarily, is a signal to Israel that it must change its approach if it hopes to remain a relevant player in the region. Israel's strategic options moving forward. To avoid further isolation, Israel must reconsider its current strategies. It must address the root causes of its growing isolation and arrogance. And there are several pathways forward if Israel wishes to reclaim its standing in the region and on the global stage. First, engaging in meaningful peace with Palestine. Israel's continued occupation of Palestinian territories and its treatment of Palestinians are perhaps the greatest sources of its international isolation. If Israel is serious about maintaining its regional influence, it must demonstrate a genuine commitment to resolving the Palestinian conflict. This will require painful compromises, including the possibility of recognizing Palestinian statehood and withdrawing from occupied territories. By addressing the Palestinian issue, Israel could begin to repair its relationships with Arab nations and improve its standing in the international community. A lasting peace with Palestine would also remove one of the major points of contention between Israel and Iran, potentially de-escalating tensions between the two nations. Second, reassessing its relationship with Iran. Israel's aggressive stance towards Iran has only served to heighten tensions and fuel instability in the region. Rather than engaging in military strikes and covert operations against Iranian targets, Israel should consider a diplomatic approach. Engaging with Iran diplomatically would not only reduce the risk of a larger conflict, but also allow Israel to focus on more pressing internal challenges, such as its political fragmentation and economic difficulties. While Israel and Iran have deep-seated differences, particularly over Iran's support for Hezbollah and other militant groups, diplomacy remains the best path to long-term stability. Israel's continued reliance on military solutions is proving increasingly ineffective, as evidenced by Iran's growing influence in the region and its strengthening alliances with countries like India. Third, building new alliances in Asia. As global power shifts from the west to the east, Israel must recalibrate its foreign policy to reflect this new reality. While its relationships with the US and Europe remain important, Israel must also seek to build stronger ties with emerging powers in Asia, such as India, China, and Japan. These countries are playing increasingly important roles in shaping global trade, security, and diplomacy, and Israel cannot afford to ignore them. However, building new alliances will require Israel to adopt a more flexible, less confrontational approach to its foreign policy. Countries like India, which have strong economic ties with Iran, will not tolerate Israel's aggressive posture towards Tehran. Israel must be willing to engage in dialogue and compromise if it hopes to forge lasting partnerships in this new multipolar world. Conclusion: a new world order. India's growing support for Iran marks a significant shift in the geopolitical landscape, with far-reaching implications for Israel, the US, and the broader Middle East. As India strengthens its ties with Tehran, Israel finds itself increasingly isolated, a consequence of its own arrogance and refusal to adapt to the changing global order. Israel's aggressive policies, particularly towards Palestine and Iran, have left it vulnerable on the international stage, and its traditional alliances are no longer sufficient to maintain its hegemony. The rise of new powers in Asia, the weakening of US influence in the Middle East, and the deepening relationship between India and Iran all point to a future where Israel can no longer rely on military might and unconditional support from the West to maintain its dominance. If Israel wishes to remain relevant in this new world order, it must fundamentally reassess its approach to diplomacy, peace, and regional cooperation. By continuing on its current path, Israel risks further isolation and irrelevance in an increasingly multipolar world. However, with a shift in strategy, one that prioritizes diplomacy, peace, and engagement, Israel can still secure a place in the future of the Middle East. The question remains, will Israel recognize the need for change before it's too late, or will it continue down the path of arrogance, leading to its eventual decline?